A fairly common logical fallacy is the argument from consequences, or in other words, arguing that something must be false because if and it was true, it'd have consequences that we wouldn't like. And according to Dr. Craig, we ain't gonna like the consequences of God's non-existence. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by William Lane Craig. We got the introductory material out of the way in Chapter 1, and now we's ready to get into the meat of Dr. Craig's apologetic arguments, starting here in Chapter 2. And the first order of business is going to be to try and make it sound like a Bronze Age deity is somehow relevant in today's modern world. Dr. Craig has a whole chapter devoted to just this. And ain't that kind of strange? You'd think that if in a perfect, all-wise, all-powerful, and all-loving God actually was relevant in modern society, it wouldn't take no complicated intellectual philosophical exercise to make him sound relevant. But then again, if and they was a real loving Heavenly Father, we wouldn't need no apologists neither. So I guess Dr. Craig has to do something to maintain his job security. And he starts off with a standard marketing principle. If you wants to sell folks something they don't actually need, the first thing you gotta do is try and give them the impression that they need it. Quote, before we share with people evidence for God's existence, we may need to help them see why it matters in the first place. Otherwise, they just won't care. By showing them the implications of atheism, we can help them to see that the question of God's existence is so much more than merely adding another item to our inventory of things. End quote. And this is the same approach that folks uses to sell you shampoo. Before they say, hey, buy our shampoo, they say, hey, have you considered the serious social implications of dandruff? Dun, dun, dun. See, you want people to think that they has a serious problem that can only be fixed by buying what you're selling. So Dr. Craig don't start by claiming that he can demonstrate that God actually is relevant in modern society. He starts by trying to make it sound like a bad thing if and you don't believe in God. And that means presenting atheism in the worst possible light he can think of. It's an argument from consequences fallacy, except he has to cherry pick and exaggerate the consequences in order to make them sound bad. So let's let Dr. Craig have his say and then see if we can't clarify some of the points he's going to be distorting or leaving out. After mentioning a type of argument called reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to the absurd, he says this, quote, this label is especially appropriate when it comes to atheism. Many philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus have argued that if God does not exist, then life is absurd. Admittedly, Sartre and Camus didn't take this to be a proof of the opposite, namely that God exists. Rather, they concluded that life really is absurd. Nevertheless, their analysis of human existence shows us clearly the grim implications of atheism. End quote. And in a sidebar right beside this paragraph, he includes the following note. Quote, reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity, is a form of argument that proves a statement by demonstrating that its opposite is absurd. End quote. And if you's just a layman and you's reading this in this context, there's a pretty good chance you'll come away thinking that Sartre and Camus has proved that God exists by showing that his non-existence is absurd. And it's fair to say that this is exactly the impression that Dr. Craig is most likely trying to create. But it's absolutely a false impression. And in fact, there's lots of shenanigans going on here. So let's see if we can't unpack it all. First of all, Dr. Craig is taking the philosophy of Sartre and Camus way out of context. And it ain't really credible to suppose that he don't know he's doing it, being as how he has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham. taking a single word out of a complex philosophical discussion and presenting it as if the ordinary naive understanding of the word accurately expressed the entire philosophy is just plain malpractice on the part of any trained philosopher. Secondly, he's guilty of an equivocation fallacy here. Logical absurdity in the sense of reductio ad absurdum ain't the same thing as absurdity in the subjective emotional sense. A reductio ad absurdum argument shows that a proposition is true by showing that if we assume it's false, it necessarily leads to a conclusion that can't possibly be true, not just to a conclusion that we don't like. For historical reasons, we use the technical term absurd to describe the logical impossibility of the conclusion being true. But that don't mean that how we feel emotionally about a particular conclusion has anything at all to do with whether or not the conclusion is actually true. Thirdly, this whole argument is, of course, an argument from consequences, which is a logical fallacy. The fact that some of us might not like it if life turned out to be absurd ain't got nothing to do with whether or not life actually is absurd. Objective reality ain't under no obligations to conform to our personal preferences. And spoiler alert, a lot of time it don't. So it ain't safe to assume that something must be false just 'cause we don't like it. And finally, all these deep philosophical arguments over whether life is ultimately absurd in some sense ain't really all that relevant to how we actually experience life in the real world every day. Yes, if when we eat, we know we're just going to get hungry again. That don't mean it's absurd for us to enjoy a good meal. If we take a shower and get ourselves all cleaned up, we're just going to get dirty again, but that don't mean that personal hygiene is absurd. Things ain't got to produce eternal results in order to be worth doing. I'd even argue that the ephemeral nature of what we do is what gives meaning and purpose to our actions. If everything we did had such permanent results that there was no point in ever doing them again, eventually we'd run out of things to do, and then what? But now I've gone and mentioned meaning and purpose, and Dr. Craig's going to have a few things to say about that. He starts off by defining God as, quote, an all-powerful, perfectly good creator of the world who offers us eternal life, end quote, and then says that if such a God does not exist, then life has no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose. Quote, these three notions, meaning, value, and purpose, though closely related, are distinct. Meaning has to do with significance, why something matters. Value has to do with good and evil, right and wrong. Purpose has to do with a goal, a reason for something. End quote. Notice that as defined by Dr. Craig, each of these three terms is referring to something subjective, something whose existence and character depend on some person perceiving and experiencing them. Meaning has to do with significance to somebody, why something matters to somebody. A steak dinner means something different to somebody who's a vegetarian than to somebody who ain't. Dark clouds rolling in can mean something different depending on whether you was hoping to go for a walk or hoping that your crops would get some rain. It's subjective. Purpose has to do with a goal, but goals don't exist unless there's somebody who wants to achieve them. If a rock falls off a cliff, there's definitely a specific direction it's going to go, but that don't mean it has any kind of goal in mind. Somebody has to want to throw a rock off a cliff, and then they can achieve that goal by throwing it on purpose. But without somebody to want it, there ain't no goal and there ain't no purpose to it. And that's true even if you imagine that there's some God somewhere who's the one that wanted the rock to fall. And value here is kind of the odd man out on account of the peculiar definition that Dr. Craig has given to it. Value has to do with the importance that somebody assigns to something and whether or not it's something they want or something they don't. But again, it's subjective. I expect you could relate value to stuff like good and evil or right and wrong by saying we want what's good and right and we don't want what's evil and wrong. But any way you look at it, it's still subjective. I reckon that Dr. Craig has given value such a contrived definition on account of he don't want it to be so obvious that value is subjective, and so it comes out sounding surprising and awkward. But let's move on. Dr. Craig uses another equivocation fallacy to set up a false dichotomy between theism and atheism. Quote, "My point is that given atheism, these beliefs are all subjective illusions, the mere appearance of meaning, value, and purpose, even though objectively speaking, there isn't any." End quote. Dr. Craig is equivocating on the distinction between real versus unreal and the distinction between objective versus subjective. It's true that pain, for example, is subjective. If and they ain't nobody subjectively experiencing pain, that pain don't exist. It's subjective. That most definitely does not mean, however, that pain ain't real or that it can't have objective consequences like elevated blood pressure and rapid heartbeat. Just because it's subjective don't mean that it's an illusion. Or take thought itself, for example. Thoughts only exist when somebody's thinking them. They ain't got independent, objective existence. But that don't mean that you's hallucinating when you think that you're thinking. Thoughts is subjectively real, and that's real enough. Notice, too, that Dr. Craig is cherry-picking only the good subjective experiences. He wants to smear atheism by saying if and God don't exist, that would mean our positive experiences of meaning, value, and purpose would be illusions. He's setting up bad consequences in order to appeal to an argument from consequences fallacy. But he don't mention the fact that there's also other things that we experience subjectively that's negative experiences. Using the exact same logic, Dr. Craig could just as easily argue that if and God ain't real, then fear, pain, sadness, and despair would all be mere subjective illusions. Or in other words, atheism would lead to a world where all these bad things wouldn't really exist. They don't possess independent, objective existence apart from the folks that's experiencing them, so they supposedly just illusions. But Dr. Craig don't want to argue that because that'd make atheism look pretty good, and he don't want that. He's here to smear atheism by using an equivocation fallacy to create a false dichotomy between God existing and a cherry-picked list of good qualities that he claims would not be real. This is a critical and fatal flaw in Dr. Craig's thinking, and he ain't the only one who's making this mistake. Lots of other Christians also make the same fallacious argument, and it's worth pointing out that what's driving them to make this mistake is their religious beliefs. Dr. Craig is a smart feller, and he ought to be able to see that this is a false dichotomy and a dishonest way to describe subjective realities. But he can't because he needs to make this mistake in order to lend some kind of relevance to his imaginary God. And I suppose it goes without saying that if and his God was real, he wouldn't need to do that. Anyways, having made this mistake, Dr. Craig naturally takes it to a ridiculous extreme. Quote, "If God does not exist, our lives are ultimately meaningless, valueless, and purposeless despite how desperately we cling to the illusion to the contrary." End quote. But again, just because something is subjective don't mean that it's necessarily a delusion. Even if God was real, meaning, value, and purpose would still be subjective. The only way a believer can experience meaning, value, and purpose is the same way everybody else does, with or without a God. And like I said, Dr. Craig ain't as dumb as the arguments he's making here. I think he senses at some level that the existential horror he's trying to manufacture is a big old nothing burger. So he tries to crank up the volume by adding in the word ultimately. He says our lives is ultimately meaningless, valueless, and purposeless. But again, this is cherry-picking in order to make it all sound bad. Pain, fear, and suffering is also subjective, so he could just as easily have said that if and God don't exist, our lives is ultimately without pain, fear, and suffering, no matter how much we cling to the quote-unquote illusion that these things is real. The problem with ultimately is that it ain't a useful perspective. Sure, you can make anything seem insignificant if you compares it to infinity, but that's a sword that cuts both ways. Suppose you did have eternal life. What quote-unquote ultimate meaning, value, and purpose would your life have? What you gonna do with all that time? Doing the same thing over and over and over and over again ain't what you'd call a life of meaning and value and purpose. That's called drudgery, monotony, and boredom. That's the kind of life we use as an example of pointless, meaningless existence. On the other hand, if you do something a finite number of times and then stop, whatever it is you're doing eventually becomes insignificant, because once you stop, you have to do something else for the remaining infinite amount of time. And the significance of what you just got done doing is going to vanish into the unfathomable depths of infinity, which makes that activity pointless as well. Ultimately, when measured against an infinite timescale, everything eventually becomes pointless and meaningless with or without any God. But so what? Meaning, value, and purpose comes from what we's experiencing here and now, and not from some illusory promise of endless existence after you die. This was the single biggest shock I had when I first realized that the gospel's a myth. All my adult life, I'd been steeped in this narrative about how our worldly life had no ultimate meaning and that true meaning was to be found only in Jesus Christ. But once I was free from that particular bit of indoctrination, I was absolutely astounded by the overwhelming abundance of meaning that exists in life here and now. Not only had Christianity failed to prepare me for this, it was actively militating against it. And that's precisely what Dr. Craig is trying to do here. He's trying to deny actual real-world meaning, value, and purpose so he can sell us his illusory promise of so-called ultimate meaning, value, and purpose. He's trying to deprive us of what we already has in order to sell us a promise of something that neither we nor he is ever going to get. And he's trying to exploit our instinct for self-preservation in order to sell us his bill of goods, which honestly is about the same level of psychological manipulation as trying to sell folks junk by appealing to their sex drive. Quote, everyone must come face to face with what theologian Paul Tillich has called the threat of non-being. For though I know now that I exist, that I am alive, I also know that someday I will no longer exist, that I will no longer be, that I will die. This thought is staggering and threatening, to think that the person I call myself will cease to exist and that I will be no more. End quote. And notice he does not mention that there was once a time when we was not yet. 1,000 years from now, we ain't going to exist, but then again, 1,000 years ago, we didn't exist neither. Was that really so bad? Was there anything to be afraid of in our earlier non-existence? As material organisms, we has a survival instinct that we's inherited from generations of ancestors who also would rather survive than not. And the reason we inherited a survival instinct is because the critters that didn't have it didn't survive long enough to leave lasting descendants. So I get it. Death is scary and fear is a powerful emotion that can cloud our thinking and make us more susceptible to psychological manipulation by folks that's out to deceive us. And we need to be mindful of that and not let ourselves be stampeded into buying whatever they're selling without careful consideration. But Dr. Craig don't want that. He wants us to feel too terrified and threatened to dig into his claims and see if they holds up. He wants to exploit our natural fear of dying in order to make us want to buy the story he's selling. And that's just a little bit dishonest on account of the story he wants to sell us ain't going to keep us from dying. And dying is the real problem here. Christians die just the same as anybody else. Believe all you want about mansions in heaven and pie in the sky by and by, you ain't supposed to get any of that until after you've been through the experience of dying. But once the dying part's over, we ain't going to have no survival instinct for Dr. Craig to try and manipulate to sell us his little narrative. And that leaves us without nothing to fear from our own future non-existence. Meanwhile, the prospect of endless conscious existence holds horrific consequences that few believers stop to think about. Either the endless tedium of doing the same things over and over and over and over again, or else a pointless existence of doing things a finite number of times, only to have the full length of eternity still stretching out in front of you. And this is where belief in the afterlife exposes itself as fantasy and wishful thinking, because this is where believers will start fantasizing about all the amazingly fun and interesting stuff they's going to be able to do once they gets to heaven. And they's going to imagine seeing lost loved ones and maybe meeting saints from long ago and getting together to sing all their favorite hymns and, of course, bowing down to worship God like it says in the Bible. And maybe that all sounds like an awesome time for the few minutes you spend thinking about it, but then what? You still got all of eternity to keep yourself busy and interested, so what you gonna do? Well, folks will fantasize about being able to do all the fun stuff they enjoyed doing while they was mortal. The supposed joys of heaven is just going to be a continuation of the pleasures of earth without any of the negative experiences of mortal life. Which, if you think about it, just goes to show that it's the material things here on earth that gives meaning and purpose to life. And that's why folks imagining these things continuing in heaven. Dr. Craig wants to sell us some kind of Christian meaning and purpose that skeptics supposedly ain't got. But when it comes time to deliver, all he's really got is the same secular experiences that we all already has, just projected out longer. And sure, you can say that Christians has the ability to worship God and unbelievers don't, but that's only a benefit if and you can produce an actual real God who's worthy of worship. And so far, apologists ain't been able to do that. All they has is stories and arguments, and we just has to trust them that it's all correct. And that ain't faith in God, that's faith in the apologists. The bottom line here is that apologists is trying to sell us fantasies by manipulating our fear of dying and hoping we don't think too much about what endless existence would actually entail. And speaking from personal experience, I can tell you that I already bought them fantasies when I was very young, and I found out it's a scam. Fantasies is pleasant if you don't think too hard about them, but what the Christian faith demands in return is too high a price to pay for fiction. And if I can warn one other person in time to keep them from falling for the same scam, I'll be content. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we're going to continue working our way through Chapter 2, and Dr. Craig is going to continue trying to manipulate us into buying his story. But we ain't going to fall for it. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.